you ever had anybody come up to you and say, I don't want to complain, but... Isn't that fascinating? I don't want to complain, but... And you know you are getting ready to get hit with the complaints of the century, right? I'm just always so fascinated by that. Not long ago, TripAdvisor put out some of the complaints they have received online, which I find so fascinating. Here's one. On my holiday to India, I was disgusted to find out that every restaurant served curry. I don't like spicy food. Here's another one. At a big hotel in Australia that's known for this soup. This guy was so impatient about getting his soup, he finally just started eating it on his own, and he complained that it was too thick. It was only after he finished it that he found out that was the gravy, not the soup. Following a trip to one of the big theme parks, this actually ended up on a theme park website, a woman was very angry and complained that the weather was too hot and all of her children's ice cream melted. An air traveler voiced her discontent when she had planned on playing I Spy with her son from the plane to see what they saw below, and the cloud cover was just too heavy and they couldn't play. What fascinates me is that you would think about this and then even think to write about it afterwards. Another really fun complaint is there was a guy in New York once who robbed a bank. And he had asked the teller very specifically for $20,000, and she only gave him like $16,000. So he called the bank to complain, and they were able to arrest him. Isn't that fascinating? Complaining and whining. I think it gets us somewhere, right? Well, you know, there was a study done not long ago, and this really is a place, called the Journal of Social, Evolutionary, and Cultural Psychology. And they studied all different kinds of sounds. And guess what the most annoying sound in the whole universe is? Whining. That's absolutely right. It was found to be the most disturbing and distracting sound. From a puppy to a kid to an adult, we can't stand whining. And it has been a historical thing, this complaining and whining. We're not the first. In fact, Paul really figured out this whining thing early on, and you can see throughout his ministry that he really encourages us not to do that. I think a good focus verse for us today is this from Philippians. He says, do all things without complaining. Pretty clear. Do all things without complaining. But then he takes it the next step and says, or bickering with each other. Do all things without complaining or bickering with each other. That's Paul's take on it all. Now, what's interesting to me and why the sermon is titled Whine Not or Whine Not is the Bible is pretty confusing when it comes to whining, if I'm going to be honest with you. Like, one would think that you're not supposed to whine, right? Because it's so annoying and so terrible and complaining. But do you know that in the Old Testament, God tends to respond to whining, at least for a little bit? And people whine, oh my goodness, from the very top of the Bible, people whine, you know, the whole Adam and Eve thing, getting taken out of the garden, he blames her, it's all this whining, and then there's the whole ark thing, but nobody complains like the folks who were stuck in Egypt, the Israelites, stuck in Egypt, get out of slavery and are making their way to the promised land. No one complains like them. It starts really early in Exodus, making the leave on out. In Exodus, it says this, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. It's really kind of probably how it sounded to Moses, I think. Well, guess what God does? God responds. God responds. We don't have enough to eat. Food falls from heaven. I know we have water, but it's bitter. He gives them sweet water. And this goes on for a little while during the Exodus. But then even God gets enough of it. We go on into Numbers, and they're still complaining. After God takes care of their needs, they're still complaining. In Numbers, it goes like this. The people griped about life in the wilderness, how hard they felt things were for them. And these evil complaints came upon the ears of the Eternal One. And he was furious. He was furious about the ingratitude, the faithlessness, and the lack of vision. His anger was kindled, and his fire raged among them, and devoured some of the camp's perimeter. The people of Israel cried out and ran to Moses and begged him, "Do something!" Moses did. Moses prayed to God on their behalf, and the flames settled down. On account of this incident of the burning fire from the Eternal, the place where it happened is called Taberah, which means burning. Now, what I love here is God's like, this is kind of nuts, right? I take care of your needs. It's not quite working. So something makes me think that in the midst of the fire, maybe a few of them got burned up. And maybe, just maybe, the others thought, we better find some other approach. And it changed dramatically. Now, it really changes dramatically in the New Testament, right? So God sends us Jesus. And Jesus, I believe, kind of takes a different approach than perhaps in the Old Testament. Jesus takes more of a therapeutic approach to the complaining of people. He says this in Matthew. He reminds us that our mouths simply shape the heart's impulses into words. That's pretty cool, isn't it? For the mouth simply shapes the heart's impulses into words. I think what Jesus is saying is we need to live our lives from the inside out. We need to get our hearts right with God. We need to get our life taken care of on the inside and then deal with the outside of life. If we're living a life of complaining and nothing is working out the way we want to, something tells me we are looking out here instead of in here. Perhaps you've done that before. Perhaps you've looked around and you've thought, this isn't working, like the people on vacations, right? Like those people on vacations taking time after they've had a vacation to go and write a complaint, never taking a moment to pause and say, I have such a life that I can go to India. I have such a life that my kids can go to a theme park and get ice cream that melts. The people aren't thinking that way, and I think that's what Jesus is getting to here. You got to start from the inside out, then try to complain. Start with your heart and how God has transformed your life with this heart. See, I think if we start living life that way, a difference. It'll make a real difference. We've all been around folks who complain, haven't we? We've all been around folks who not only complain, but the complaint is the entire story, right? So perhaps it's been you before. And I have to tell you, I think complaining is okay on one level. I think complaining is okay as long as, just like the persistent prayer we talked about the other day, is it moves us to someplace else. If naming that concern and that complaint gives you an opportunity to look at something different, then by all means do that. But we all have that one friend. We all have that one person in our lives who sometimes their whole mode of functioning is complaint, that they can't ever see the goodness in life. We all know that gets difficult. And for me, that is someone who has found a way to live their lives not in faith, but of this world. And it's our job to find a way to love the people who complain and to love ourselves when we complain too much. So we have God and Moses who dealt with complaining in a particular way, hands-on. Then we have Jesus who takes a therapeutic approach to dealing with it, saying start with your heart and work on the way out. And then the third person we're going to talk about in the Bible today who deals with complaining is a guy named Paul. Now, he is a very interesting character when it comes to complaining. If you look at Paul and you read Paul's letters, he has a lot of reason to complain. In fact, in 2 Corinthians, he names it in particularly. He talks about having this thorn in his side. Now, we have really no idea what it was. Some people think it was a physical ailment, perhaps migraines or epilepsy. Other people think he just had a really bad case of sciatica. Others believe that maybe it was a person in his life who he couldn't get away from, but he talks about having a thorn in his side. And he could take a lot of time to complain about that, but instead of complaining, do you know what he does? He figures out that God gave him this thorn in his side as an opportunity to get closer to God. That's what he says. That God gave him this ailment as a reminder that God loves him and God's love is greater than this ailment, and that he had something profound to share even in the midst of this ailment. Now, when you think about Paul, and if this really was a physical thing, he traveled miles and miles and miles to share the love of God in the world, and he never wavered from that call. He never complained about fatigue. He didn't whimper about his hardships. He never talks about his disappointment. All he knows is he has one mission in life, and that is to share the love of Christ. What he says is, I have been crucified with Christ, where my old way of being has been changed, and now it is I who live in Christ, and Christ who lives in me, and together we're transforming this world. I think what Paul does throughout his ministry is he realizes that that is his mission and that is his goal. And if he is complaining, then that's not getting him any closer to the goal that he established for himself and the goal that God established with him. Throughout his ministry, he has situations that could lead him into all kinds of complaining, but he doesn't. Instead, he uses every opportunity to share the love of Christ. Now, I mentioned earlier those complainers in your life. The truth about life is indeed that we all complain. And the truth about life is there are some people who are living to complain. We have to be intentional about our interactions with one another. And first, we have to be mindful of where our heart is. I think a lot of us, myself included, will sometimes sit in these conversations to the point where you don't pick up the phone anymore. And I don't think that's what we're supposed to do. I think when we are in situations with people who are complaining, our goal should be first to make sure our heart is in the right place. And then to ask God very specifically, God, what gift have you given this person? What gift does this person have in life that I can just pull out here right now? That gift on that particular day might just be the fact that this person breathing makes life better for trees. But it's a gift in and of itself, right? Look for that gift and grab onto that. And when the story starts going back to complaining, come back to the gift. Come back to the special person that they are. Do not let complaining guide and lead your conversation. Tried this past week. It's hard, but you can do it. And if nothing more, if the person who's complaining isn't getting the results they want from you, they're going to move on to the next person. So let them do it. Let them do it. Because you are here to share the love of God in all circumstances. You are here to live from the inside out with your heart. That's why you're here. Don't let others or other things get in the way of that. And if you live your life that way, you can indeed have an impact on them in a profound way. I love how Paul not only has his mission for himself, but he recognizes it's a mission for someone else as well. I learned that very particularly this past year with Trevor. Trevor, I think, was the youngest student I've ever worked with, and I never before felt like kind of that mentoring role with the students I had worked with, I think because they were all mostly my age. But I, for the first time, kind of understood Paul and Timothy's relationship in a different way. I really wanted to help Trevor, and by the way, Trevor just got his own church. Pray for Trevor. And he, we wanted to make sure we were preparing him for that experience. And I love what Paul says to Timothy here, that I think we too can live from and with as well. And what you could do here is either put Trevor's name or your own name. But what Paul said to Timothy, and what I say to you, and what I say to Trevor is, Timothy, do everything you can to present yourself to God as a man who is fully genuine, a worker unashamed of your mission, a guide capable of leading others along the correct path defined by the word of truth. Stay away from ungodly babbling because it will only lead to deeper into a godless life. Once these empty voices start to speak, Timothy, they infect and they spread, and soon the body is consumed with its cancer. He's making it clear that God's message is in you. It's not happening someplace else. That's in you too. It's not happening someplace else. Be fully genuine and unashamed that you have a love that can overcome complaining. I love how the psalmist puts it. The psalmist encourages us to ask God to explore us and to know the real us and to dig deeply and discover who we are. Ask God to do that for you so you can truly know about your heart and live from the inside out. That's what Moses did. That's what Jesus did. That's what Paul did. That's what Timothy did. That's what Trevor is doing. We seek to be in real relationship with God, and then we can handle any conversation that we start or that someone else starts. We lost a gem this past week at the garden. This is Ted Bradfield. Ted just prayed 2 weeks ago. The girls had sung, and he was all excited about it and was so excited to be part of the garden community. He died last Sunday evening. And one thing that I noticed about Ted always is Ted was not a complainer. Ted was not a guy who said, this is how I'm living my life, this is how I'm retiring, and now that I'm retired, I'm picking up the remote and I'm going on a Netflix binge and living the rest of my life in this chair. At a time in his life when most people would be settling down, Ted started going that much more. And what amazes me about Ted is not only did he not complain, but he lived his life in such a way that he was able to handle the circumstances that presented themselves. Ted had a particular idea of how he thought life was going to turn out, like most of us, right? This is when I'm going to retire. This is how I'm going to live happily ever after. This is going to happen. And let me tell you, none of those plans turned out the way that he had anticipated. But instead of saying, I wish it was some other way, he lived into the way it turned out. And what's so amazing to me, and particularly around the retirement piece, which happened much earlier than he thought it was going to, if it had not turned out the way it had, he and his lovely bride, Kathy, would not have had an amazing life that they had. Maybe not with the amount of money that they had envisioned, but they had the time and the experience together. And that far outweighed any of the financial gains of 2 more or 3 more years of working. He saw his life as a blessing, and he believed it was his job to share that blessing with others. Ted, at a time in your life when you would be thinking, I don't want to do anything else, joined the garden, came over here, joined the prayer team, became part of the marketing team, became part of the community, because he believed that God was at work here. One of my favorite Ted stories was they lived in Florida a few months a year, and he was down in Florida, and they went to a Methodist church down there, and one Tuesday, the men had breakfast on Tuesday, and one Tuesday they were having breakfast, and during breakfast, one of the men in the group said, you know what? Women in ministry, it's all wrong. We have to see if we can do something about this. So Ted listened, and the men all agreed with him. Ted said, finally, you know, guys, I got to tell you, I totally disagree with you. And then he went on to share his experience with his amazing minister back in Indianapolis, the woman who married him, the woman who helped him through his family. No, I'm just joking. Not really, but I am joking. But he told them the power of female ministry in the Midwest and that they were really missing out on something. Now, what amazes me most about Ted is he didn't change the minds of anybody in that group, but he didn't leave the group. And he didn't complain about the way they thought. That was about them, that was not about him. He continued to live through his heart, he continued to love the people he was with, and he continued to walk this journey with faith and love. I think there's an important lesson in that for us, friends. When life isn't turning out the way we want to, stop complaining and looking from the outside and go within and say, God, these are blessings in my life, and for that I am thankful. Seek to live from that place. Seek to live from the heart out. Paul again later puts it this way. He says, friends, no matter what happens in life, always rejoice in the Lord. Never tire of saying it. Rejoice. Keep your gentle nature so that all people know what it looks like to walk in his footsteps. The Lord is ever present with us. Don't be anxious about things. Instead, pray. Pray about everything. He longs to hear your requests, so talk to God about your needs and be thankful for what has come. And know that the peace of God, a peace that is beyond any and all human understanding, will stand watch over your hearts and minds in Jesus, the Anointed One. Will you pray with me? God, you know we all whine and complain sometime. Oh, help us not to get stuck there. Pull us back to our hearts. Pull us back to the gifts and the graces that you have blessed us with to live each day. Give us eyes to see opportunity instead of obstruction. Give us ears to listen for a song instead of noise. Give us a heart that can deal with any situation in loving ways. Be with our brothers and sisters who are stuck in a complaint trap. Give us the courage to seek positive outcomes for all who complain. And above all, help us to rejoice always, to give thanks for everything good as a gift from you, and to seek that peace, a peace that passes all understanding. Amen.